Well, good morning, Good News Chapel. Once again, so good to be with you. If you're like me, you've been gripped with the Olympics lately. I find myself, because it seems to be airing all day long on various channels, that I find myself throughout at random spots in the day just turning it on to see which event I might catch. And I've caught some pretty unique events, things I didn't know existed and certainly were not part of the Olympics. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of these or not. There's one called Olympic handball, which I had never heard of or seen before. Handball, when I was a kid, was much different. It was a big rubber ball that we hit against a wall. This is different. Olympic handball is kind of like water polo, but without the water. If that helps you get a picture of what Olympic handball might be like. Another one that I caught this year was this an event called trampoline, where gymnasts are launching themselves on these huge trampolines, like 20 feet, 20 plus feet into the air and spinning and doing all amazing things. The crazy thing is they have people off to the side with these big mats just in case, because a lot of times these gymnasts get off line and fall and can really hurt themselves. So it's a little bit crazy. And then another one that I had never heard of before, I've originally thought it was dressage, but I've been since corrected. That is dressage. And this is a horse event where it's kind of like horse ballet, in that the rider, through a bunch of imperceptible kind of commands, gets horses to high step and dance around and do various precise movements and things like this. And this year, Germany happened to win the gold medal, just beating out the Dutch. It was riveting. But I bring these up because have you ever tried to explain something that's hard to explain? That if you're trying to explain one of these events, for example, to someone who's never seen it, the best we can do is kind of give a metaphor or give an analogy and say, well, it's kind of like this. And the whole idea of what teaching is about, a lot of what good teaching is about, is activating people's background knowledge, starting with something that they know, and then from there, trying to get them to imagine, trying to get them to see what the new thing is. This is anytime you're trying to teach a difficult concept, like how to drive a stick shift in San Francisco, or how to explain the nature of light and how light moves. You know, these are abstract, scientific, automotive kind of things that are a little bit hard, a little tricky sometimes. So the best we can do is say, well, it's kind of like this. Olympic handball is kind of like water polo. Okay, I know water polo, but now take away the water. Oh, okay, I start to see it. And I bring this up because today, in today's text, we're still in John chapter 6. Jesus is going to teach his audience and us, what does it mean to actually believe in him? In this idea that believing is a bit of an abstract idea. What does that exactly mean when we say, I believe in Jesus? Is it just a head thing? Is it just kind of I go through motions? Or is it something deeper than that? And Jesus in John 6 is having a conversation with a growing group of skeptics who do not believe. They are not convinced that he is the Messiah. And so Jesus has already explained how faith is born in the heart of a person. And the reason why they don't believe is because God has not opened their eyes yet. But now today he's going to build on that, on how faith is born, to go even deeper. How does faith grow inside of a person? And what does faith look like? What does faith feel like? What does believing in Jesus look and feel like? And again, it's an abstract concept. It's not an easy thing to try to define. What does it mean to believe? But Jesus, being a good teacher, is going to give a metaphor. He's going to give an analogy. And specifically, the analogy he's going to give is food and eating, which I'm really grateful because I like to eat. I imagine you do too. And food is a concept that I can relate to. We have some common background knowledge in the enjoyment and the function of food in a person's life. Already Jesus has referred to himself as the bread of life. This whole chapter of John 6 has been about Jesus as the bread of life. And so he's using a food analogy already. But today he really presses home this metaphor to help his listeners understand what it means to believe in him. So we're going to pick up today in John 6, verses 47 through 51. And here's what Jesus, we're right in the middle of the conversation. Here's Jesus going on. He says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." So just to begin here, just kind of get a reference of what we just heard there. Two things to notice in that text. Number one is the astounding promises Jesus makes throughout that text. In just those few verses, he makes some amazing promises that those who believe, he says in verse 47, have eternal life. I mean, they already have it, and it's eternal life. And later he says, those who eat of this bread will not die. We're never going to die? And that finally those who eat will also live forever. He reemphasizes that at the beginning. And these are just amazing, astounding promises that he makes. Now, again, when we've talked about this in previous weeks, when the Bible talks about eternal life, it's not really talking about duration necessarily, but rather it's talking about a quality of life. That it's not, heaven is not eternal boredom, it's eternal life. And in the Bible, there's, in the original Greek, there's two words for life. There's bios, where we get the word biology, which means just kind of the everyday existence of things. But then there's another word of zoe, which is about that kind of abundant life, the vital, connected, intimate, life-giving source of power and grace that comes from God that really animates life and fills us with joy and hope and peace and a redemption of our humanity. That's the kind of life, when Jesus says he is the bread of life, that's what he brings. Not just more existence, not just an enduring boredom or something like that, but real life. And it is eternal, but eternal, abundant life. And this life is so transforming, so gripping who we are he says we already have it. When you believe, you have eternal life. It's not something we're waiting for. It starts today. And it's so powerful, so defining, so all-encompassing of who we are, that we're new creations, that even when this body someday breathes its last and turns to dust, at that day, I don't die. I keep on living because I already have this eternal life. And it keeps on going. That I won't, at that moment when this body fails, there won't even be an instant where I feel death. I'll continue to live. And if you're a believer, you will continue to live and never die. It's this eternal life that Jesus offers, this eternal, vital, abundant life, is in stark contrast with the life-draining effects of sin and shame and despair and death that our world lives with. Jesus has come to offer real life to the world. Not just biological existence, but vital, intimate, connected, life-giving rivers of living water abundance with God, as we were always meant to have. That's the first thing to notice, is the amazing promises that Jesus makes in this passage. And secondly, is to see how Jesus, in order to try to for us to understand these promises and understand what it means to believe in him, he's going to make a comparison between believing and eating. And notice at the beginning, in verse 47, Jesus says, whoever believes has eternal life. But then by the end, in verse 50, he's going to say, whoever eats of this bread will live forever. And so he's made this transition. And since believing is this abstract internal mystery inside of a person, the question again is, what does it mean to believe? Is believing just head knowledge about the Bible? I know enough facts, I know some theology, I know doctrine, and I've signed off it, so yes, I agree with that. Or is believing just because I go through motions? You know, I go to church and I sit up and I stand down and I sing songs and I go, you know, my family was Christian, so I guess I'm a Christian, kind of heritage kind of thing. Or is believing something deeper than that? Something more than just head knowledge or the motions I go through, but something deep, internal, within me. In this way, I think what we'll see today is that believing is a lot like eating food. Jesus again declares himself as the bread of life in order to lead his audience to understand what it means to believe in him. The only context, and we saw in this passage, the Exodus is brought up, and manna that they ate, that the forefathers had eaten in the desert. They earlier in the conversation, they'd asked Jesus about this, like, hey, Moses provided manna in the desert. What about you, Jesus? Can you top that? Can you do something better than that? And Jesus points out that the manna that they ate in Exodus did not bring life. They died. Now, it's not that the manna was poison and they died on the spot. No, they still lived out 40 years or whatever it was. They still had biological existence. But the kind of Zoe, vital life that it was meant to bring, that not just the eating of the manna, but all the miracles of the Exodus, they were all signs that were meant to get people to look up and behold the wonder of their God and to fall in love with him, and with new hearts that would desire to obey him and honor him and live for his glory and live in the joy of his peace. That manna didn't produce that. The people continued to grumble, they continued to complain, they wanted to go back to Egypt. It did not produce the life that it was meant to produce. And it was because of their dead and hard-hearted unbelief that they couldn't enter the promised land. In contrast to this death in Exodus, Jesus points to himself now as the living bread that has come down from heaven. And those who eat of this bread, he says, will not die, but instead live forever. And so by the end, Jesus is using this analogy of eating to try to get them to understand, like they ate manna and they died. But if you eat this bread of who I am, you will live forever. So the question is why? Why use food as an analogy to try to understand what it means to believe in him? I think it's one of those things that we can probably all relate to. Do you like food? I'm assuming you do. I love food. And it's a big part of our lives, and it's connected. I think there's two reasons why food is such a useful and powerful analogy to use to get us to understand what it means to believe in Jesus. That, first of all, food is emotional. You see, we eat food not just to kind of satiate hunger. That's part of it. But food connects to our emotions. We have these taste buds, we have palates. And that allow us to enjoy food. God's given us this ability to really enjoy food with spices and flavors and textures and aromas, to smell it as well. And that taste and smell of food, when we have that, it awakens emotions inside of us. It can stir up memories. It can take us back to another time and another place and people that we know and love and our culture and all these deep, intimate, emotional connections we have around food. It's powerful. You could probably think of that. Is there a certain food, maybe your mother made or your dad cooked up, or it was part of a certain holiday, or just a smell of a spice. When you smell curry, it just reminds you of being a kid again. Or some dish of lasagna or whatever it was, or cookies or something like that. They just kind of takes you back to a certain time. For me, my mom, she wasn't the greatest cook necessarily, and I don't mean to throw her under the bus there. It wasn't that she couldn't cook. My mother was a single mom who was raising 3 boys on her own and had to work 2 jobs in order to do that. So she just didn't have the time to cook. So I grew up kind of with a lot of microwave meals. I learned how to cook for myself, and that's just what it was. But my mother, she could bake. My mother was a good baker. And so I remember one thing, she would make this thing called pan cookies, and I wish I could find the recipe. I haven't had them in decades, but I remember them, where she would take a whole baking sheet and just smear all these different ingredients on the baking sheet itself. I know there was brown sugar in it and some egg and walnuts and some other, and it would bake on this pan, and then she would cut it up afterwards into these squares. And we just called them pan cookies because they were made in a pan. And I can taste them now. And not only can I taste them and remember them, but they just are so connected to the memories of my mom, and really powerful. And I'm sure you probably have some of those as well. So food, first of all, is a good analogy because it's emotional. And I think Jesus wants to see that believing in him is connected to our emotions as well. It's deep and connects to our story. Secondly, food we also know is deeply integrated into our body's health. I mean, we've always known this, but the more and more we learn about food science, we see this just becomes more and more clear, that you are what you eat, so to speak. When you eat something, it doesn't just pass through you, but rather it gets broken down and distributed into your bloodstream and to feed your cells and to affect the shape and the health of your body. There's nutrients, there's proteins, there's minerals, there's amino acids, there's fats, there's sugars, and all these get integrated into our bloodstream and feed our cells and ultimately work to build muscles and tissue and teeth and bones and affect brain chemistry and all these different things. I mean, it's what you eat really is interconnected with the health of your body. And the older we get, the more we realize we just can't eat like we used to. I can't eat like I did when I was 15 years old. And it's sad in some ways, but you just learn that the things I eat really start to affect me more and more, and the evidence of that becomes more and more evident as you get older. But there's kind of a mystery about food, that there's something that happens in the dark inside my intestines, inside my body, that's going on that's hard to describe. It's a bit abstract, and yet it's vitally connected to my health. There's this deep hidden communion between food and my body that happens. And I think that's another reason why Jesus uses food as an analogy, that there is something happening deep inside of us that's connected, not only connected to our emotions, but connected to our overall health and the choices we make and how we live our lives. I think Jesus uses the shared understanding of food to help us understand what it means to believe in him as the bread of life. Belief is not just about head knowledge, although that's certainly involved and it's a good thing. And it's not just about the motions we go through, although those can be very helpful, and acts of worship are really connected to our faith. But overall, though, there's a kind of mysterious communion that happens deep inside of me, where the truth of Jesus nourishes life to my soul. It brings both the flavor and the emotional health, as well as also the physical health, and I think how to make better choices with my life and wisdom for my life. That this is what Jesus, believing in him, and as we'll see specifically about one thing, how it brings real wholeness to us. So then that leads us to the question, well, what is it exactly, though, that we're believing about Jesus? That he existed, or that he was a good teacher, or what? What's the content that we're believing about Jesus? See, believing requires something that we believe. It requires content. We don't just believe in magic. We don't just kind of believe in wishful thinking or in unicorn dreams or anything, just kind of fuzzy stuff. We need something real that we're going to believe in. And this is what Jesus has been leading the whole thing. If we go back to the passage, that last verse in the passage for today says this. Jesus concludes this saying, "And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." And I think this is what Jesus has been driving to. This is the climax of the whole conversation in John 6. He wants us to understand this, that what we're called to believe in is the sacrifice of his flesh, and that the bread of life is believing and trusting and knowing about the cross of Christ and his sacrifice and what it accomplished and what it offers us today, for the flavor it brings to life and for the health it brings to life, and pressing into the cross. This is what it's about. This mention of flesh points forward to the sacrifice that Jesus will make with his own body on the cross. Jesus is the bread from heaven who was sent by the Father to go to the cross in our place, and by his crucified flesh and by his burial and by his resurrection, he offers a way of salvation and eternal life, eternal Zoe life, vital, life-giving, soul-refreshing life forever. The food that satisfies and nourishes our soul is resting in the work Jesus does on our behalf through the cross. That's it. That's what it's all about. Our enjoyment of food is a strong metaphor to help us understand what it means to believe in Jesus and how his sacrifice on the cross brings joy and health and hope and salvation to my whole person forever. That's it. It's this focus on the cross, too, I think, that brings real, for me as a pastor, it just brings such clarity as to what I'm called to do. I've often struggled, and I still do, like what am I really called to be doing as a pastor? And a lot of people have different expectations or even fears within myself, what I should be doing this, I should be doing that, whatever. And I've just had to listen more and more, God, what is it that you want me to do as a pastor? What am I called primarily to be focused on? And I think this passage today, and as I look more and more in the scriptures, it just helps bring a refreshing clarity as to what we are about. We are about the cross of Jesus. Just as Jesus points us here that what he wants us, the bread of life, is believing in his flesh. I was thinking of this in 1 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and he expresses it this way. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, Paul writes, "And so it was with me, brothers and sisters, when I came to you. I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power." Now, two things I take from that really speak to me. Number one is in verse 2, where Paul says, "I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." Paul says that I have one message, and one thing I want to know, and one thing I want to proclaim, and one thing I want to talk about, and one thing that needs to be at the center of everything we do, and that's to talk about Jesus Christ and him crucified. This is exactly what Jesus just said in John 6, is that he has come to give, the bread he gives to the world is his flesh, is the sacrifice of Christ, and what the cross means. And that Paul says, I just want to preach the cross because that is where all the power of God is. And so it brings clarity to me as to what I'm called to do. Week in and week out, I'm going to preach and talk and counsel and about the cross. And now that doesn't mean that we get bored with that or that it ever gets old. No, the cross is so amazing, so beautiful, so majestic and glorious that you can never touch the bottom of that ocean. I think of it like a gem. If you have a beautifully cut diamond, huge, beautifully cut diamond, and you lift up that diamond, that you can keep turning it. And every little way you turn it, you get a new angle, a new refraction of light, a new shimmer of glory and beauty that comes through it. And to me, that's what it's like looking at the cross. Keep looking at the cross, keep pressing into it. And each time you look, you're going to see something more glorious and beautiful and dynamic and just wondrous about the cross. It never, never gets old, but continually fuels and gives life. And that's the second thing, is what Paul says in verse 5, that he wants to do this. Not his own eloquence, not in trying to impress people with himself, but just proclaiming the cross in a very simple, straightforward way. Look at the cross. And by doing that, what it does is so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. And it's this empowering understanding of the cross that I pray for all of you, to know Jesus and to know his cross in such a way that it gives you those resources of God's power to give life and health and wholeness and hope to your story. That the cross is the power of God. And I know as we say that, that sounds odd. The cross, an instrument of torture, a place where Jesus was killed like a common criminal between two thieves, and people spat on him and they beat him and they mocked him. That doesn't look like a symbol of power. It looks like a symbol of weakness. It looks like a symbol of failure. And of course, it says in 1 Corinthians 1:18, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who believe, it is the power of God." And this is what God helps us see, that cross, what Jesus went through, he went through on my behalf. And he suffered for me, and he bought the price of my salvation and paid it in full, and he was risen from the dead, and he lives now at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us with grace and power and his Spirit to come. And so I just want us to understand that. My prayer is that we would know the power of the cross, and that cross will speak into every part of our lives. So no matter what you're going through, the hardest, darkest parts, the cross can speak into the difficulty of your marriage and give you the courage and the grace and the wisdom to how to address those tensions in your marriage. In raising your kids, the cross can speak. What does it mean to be a parent that learns how to listen and how to guide and how to speak and how to just make you through those difficult, especially the teen years, get you through those years with a lot of grace and love and hope, into your addictions, into your shame, into all the struggles you have at work, into all the different things that we go through. The cross speaks and has life and godliness for all things. 2 Peter 1:3. The cross is the power of God. And that's my prayer for us. 2 Peter 1:3, I'll close with this. I mentioned it already, but let me read the whole thing. 2 Peter 1:3 says, his divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence. His divine power in the cross has granted us all things that pertain to life and godliness. There's nothing that the cross doesn't touch. And my prayer is that we would be a church that would continue to press into the cross, and in that to find the power and the life that only Jesus can bring. All righty, Good News Chapel. So good to be with you today. God bless.